The movie begins by taking us back to a past incident witnessed by two policemen, Simon and Franck. While on duty, Franck appears to be expressing his frustrations to Simon about their leader, Richard. They spot Richard drinking with a prostitute, and Franck is angered by his superior's behavior. He feels that Richard doesn't deserve the recognition he's been receiving since the cases he's been working on were actually solved by Simon and Franck. Simon, however, is intoxicated and pays little attention to Franck's complaints. He eventually takes Franck home. But just as they arrive, Franck remembers he forgot to pick up a doll for his daughter from the office. He quickly jumps out of the car and rushes back to the office. However, Simon's memory becomes fragmented, and the next thing he knows, he's driving home in the rain. Tragically, his car collides with another car carrying a family, killing them instantly. As a result of his negligent actions, Simon is dishonorably discharged from the police force and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Despite serving his sentence, Simon cannot escape the guilt he feels for the accident that took the lives of an innocent family. The incident takes a toll on his mental health, and his behavior becomes that of a person suffering from severe depression. His wife, Alice, eventually grows fed up with his behavior and decides to divorce him, leaving Simon with a deep sense of guilt. Feeling unworthy of love, Simon retreats from his old life and moves away, deciding to live alone. He takes a job as a security guard in a factory, but he keeps to himself and does not interact with anyone. Even when he witnesses one of his colleagues being bullied, Simon remains silent. Meanwhile, Simon's former colleague and best friend, Franck, is still serving as a police officer and is investigating cases involving mobsters and drug dealers. He reports his findings to Richard, who is now a police inspector. Franck is struggling with an increase in violent activity by drug dealers in his jurisdiction, as they've been responsible for several recent murders. After work, Franck calls upon a prostitute named Clara to help him unwind. It becomes apparent that Franck has developed a habit of seeing Clara regularly to cope with the stress of his job. The following day, at a Matador show, Alice and her new boyfriend, Gabriel, are spotted in attendance with Theo. During the show, Theo suddenly needs to use the restroom and decides to go alone. While using the restroom, Theo unexpectedly witnesses a murder committed by a man named Edgar and his accomplices. As soon as Edgar becomes aware of Theo's presence, he orders his men to chase after him. Thankfully, Theo's small stature allows him to blend in with the crowd and he manages to escape from the mobster's pursuit. Theo rushes back to his mother and tells her what he saw in the restroom. Alice immediately goes to the police station to report the incident. Shortly thereafter, Franck contacts Simon and informs him of Alice and Theo's situation. Concerned, Simon rushes to see his ex-wife and son. Upon arrival, he finds Theo being questioned by Richard about the perpetrators he saw in the restroom. Simon quickly realizes that his family is in danger due to their involvement in a mafia case, and he pleads with Richard to assign a special police unit to guard Theo. Richard refuses Simon's request and even insults him, causing Simon to become emotional. Fortunately, Franck is there to calm him down. Despite Simon's attempts to help, Alice refuses his advice and asks him not to interfere. Her words make Simon feel guilty again and he abandons his intentions to protect his family. As Simon is leaving, he crosses paths with a suspicious man. It doesn't take long for Simon to realize that the man is a mobster who has come to kill Theo. Simon quickly gets off the bus and approaches Theo and Alice, who has just left the police station. Franck and the police escorting Theo and Alice quickly respond to the threat, but the panicked Theo escapes, leading to an intense chase between him and the mob. But this time, Simon followed his wife, who was being hunted by the mobster, while Franck and his team managed to shoot one of the two mobsters chasing Theo. Theo sought refuge in an empty warehouse, but he was eventually caught by the mafia. Fortunately, Simon arrived on the scene and engaged in a struggle with one of the mobsters pursuing his son. Simon managed to disable the mafia member. Richard and Franck arrived soon after to secure the area. The apprehended mobster could provide valuable information during interrogation. Given the ongoing danger, Franck suggested that Theo and Alice stay at his home for the night under police protection. Simon decided to accompany them. As evening approached, Alice and her boyfriend Gabriel, along with Theo and a police officer, gathered at Franck's house. Simon tried to calm Theo down in Franck's room, assuring him that everything would be all right. Meanwhile, Alice made a surprising decision to kick Gabriel out, revealing that she never liked his attitude and that he only approached her out of lust. Gabriel was left with no choice but to leave Alice. After calming down Theo, Simon said his goodbyes to Franck and entrusted his ex-wife and son to Franck's care as he had to leave for his night shift as a security guard. However, Franck realized that Simon had something unreasonable and potentially dangerous in mind. He decided to follow Simon secretly. Upon arriving at his workplace, Simon retrieved some weapons he had kept there for a long time. He also met his junior, who was often bullied and now had a black eye, indicating that he had been beaten by his seniors. Fed up with the constant bullying, Simon confronted the co-worker responsible and beat him until he lost consciousness. When Simon finished work, he found Franck waiting for him, ready to confront him. Frank was familiar with Simon's emotions as they had worked together as police officers for more than 10 years. Simon declined Frank's invitation to team up once again, as he intended to handle the situation on his own. However, Frank insisted as he did not want to see Simon get hurt. Simon was initially quiet after hearing Frank's words and eventually agreed to team up with Frank once again. The two of them kicked off their operation by interrogating a member of the mafia who had attempted to harm Theo. To access the room where the mafia member was being held, Frank came up with a clever plan to bypass the police guarding the area, allowing Simon to enter and conduct the interrogation. The mafia member initially refused to divulge any information, but Simon eventually coerced him into talking. Using a threat involving poison in the man's drip, Simon discovered that the foreign mafia group was involved in drug and prostitution activities, led by a man named Edgar, the same person Theo had seen the night of his murder. This revelation also explained why Edgar had to eliminate Theo as a witness, despite his young age. A little later, Simon and Frank received intel from Edgar's men about the location of his club and decided to infiltrate it. Once inside, they were surprised to come across Clara, a woman whom Frank had previously stolen from. Clara recognized Frank as a police officer because he once had sex with her while wearing handcuffs. Upon overhearing Clara's revelation, the mobsters set out to hunt down Simon and Frank, leading to a violent shootout within the nightclub. The chaos created by Simon and Frank disrupted Edgar's plan to make a transaction with another mobster, as the mobsters suspected Edgar's people of attempting to betray him. Meanwhile, a shootout ensued between Simon and Frank and Edgar's men. Fortunately, the two were able to escape unharmed after causing a commotion. However, they soon found themselves being chased by Edgar's men in a car. After seeking refuge in an old warehouse, Frank was unexpectedly cornered by Edgar's men, but Simon came to his aid, and they both managed to escape. Despite losing one of his favorite subordinates at the hands of Simon, Edgar had no choice but to accept the situation. Meanwhile, Simon and Frank fled, knowing that they were still in grave danger. They regrouped at Frank's house, where they took measures to secure Inspector Richard's men whom they suspected of interfering with their mission. Simon and Frank recognized that they were dealing with a more significant threat than they initially realized. They were aware that Edgar was a notorious mobster who could potentially harm Simon's child, adding an extra layer of urgency to their pursuit of him. To ensure the safety of Simon's son Theo and his ex-wife Alice, Frank proposed that they go into hiding at his brother's house outside of the city while the police worked to dismantle Edgar's mafia group. This would allow Simon to focus on his mission without having to worry about the safety of his family. The following day, Frank planned to drive Simon's family to the train station for their journey to his brother's house. However, Edgar had been monitoring them from a parked car close to Frank's house and was able to obtain information about Frank's residence from Clara. Edgar then followed Frank and Simon's family as they departed, leaving Clara behind. After arriving at the train station, Frank and Simon's family bid each other farewell, and Frank believed that everything was under control, so he decided to return to his house. However, he soon spotted Edgar and his men boarding the same train as Simon and his family. In a panic, Frank attempted to follow the train, but it had already left the station. Unable to reach Simon due to signal limitations, Frank was left feeling helpless and unsure of what to do next. He then decided to drive to the next train stop. However, while trying to contact Simon, Frank became distracted and crashed his car into another vehicle that had stopped in front of him. Fortunately, Frank survived the crash and continued on his journey to reach the train stop where Simon and his family were. As Simon dozed off on the train, the sudden sound of gunfire startled him awake. Edgar's goons had boarded the same train, and a bloody shootout ensued. When the train driver detected something amiss, he halted the train and ordered the passengers to evacuate. Meanwhile, Frank raced to catch up to the train and arrived just in time. As he approached, he heard the commotion from inside and sprinted toward the train cars. Inside, the situation had taken a turn for the worse. One of Edgar's men had stabbed Simon, but Simon refused to yield. With his last ounce of strength, Simon defended his family and allowed Alice and Theo to escape. As Frank stormed onto the train, he came face to face with Edgar. In a tense showdown, Frank outmaneuvered Edgar and managed to subdue him. With Edgar neutralized, Frank rushed to Simon's aid. Meanwhile, one of Edgar's henchmen seized Alice, and Theo sprang into action to rescue her. With quick thinking, Theo grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and used it to vanquish his mother's captor. Frank eventually located Simon, and the two raced to find Alice and Theo. However, their reunion was short-lived when Edgar emerged from the shadows, gun in hand. Before Frank could react, Edgar fired, hitting Frank in the chest. Simon was enraged and tackled Edgar, and the two engaged in a brutal fight outside the train. In a frenzy of adrenaline, Simon overpowered Edgar and pinned him to the railroad tracks as a train approached. Edgar struggled to break free, but Simon held fast, leaving them both in danger of being hit. In a final desperate act, Edgar kicked Simon off the tracks and out of harm's way. But the train arrived, and Edgar was unable to escape its deadly path. As Simon boarded the train, he was heartbroken to find Frank in critical condition. The two friends embraced, and Frank mustered the strength to make a confession. He admitted that it was he who caused Simon's downfall in the past, framing him for a drunken driving accident. It was Frank who was behind the wheel that fateful night, not Simon. Simon listened in shock as Frank explained how he had manipulated Simon's memories to exonerate himself and condemn Simon to 2 years in prison, followed by life as a security guard. After Frank's confession and apology, Simon tightly hugs his friend, knowing it would be his last words. A few days later, Simon's family attends Frank's funeral with a heavy heart. However, this event helps Simon realize that he should never stay away from his family again. The film ends with a flashback to Frank and Simon playing on the beach, captured in a photograph taken by Alice. The bittersweet memory highlights the deep friendship that existed between them. The moral that can be learned from this movie is about the consequences of dishonesty and the harm it can cause to others, even to those closest to us. It teaches us the value of honesty and the importance of taking responsibility for our actions. It reminds us that we should always strive to be truthful and transparent with those around us and to avoid deceitful behavior that can lead to irreparable damage to our relationships and to the lives of others.